Oh, yes. Come on in, everybody. We will begin the lecture when the waiting room has transferred entirely. Come on, there we are. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of February. Today's speaker is Jacqueline Victor, and her title is The Allegory of Nature in the Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature. This First Friday lecture is supported by gifts made in memory of basic program instructor Claudia Trout. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Jacqueline at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Jacqueline and I will be able to see your video, but won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Jacqueline's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select Speaker View in Zoom instead of Gallery View. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I'm the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. You can find links to more information in the chat box. The Basic Program is a 4-year non-credit certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, the Basic Program has offered its students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original thinkers in their original texts. Through focused discussion and close reading, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Registration for spring quarter courses is currently ongoing. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on March 3rd, when our speaker will be Simon Friedland. Simon's title will be Searching for Greece with All My Soul, the Classical Legacy in Germany. As I mentioned before, the presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. Now let me introduce our speaker. Jacqueline Victor is a scholar of medieval French literature. Jacqueline received her PhD in French from the University of Chicago in 2020, after which she taught as a UChicago Humanities Teaching Fellow and worked as the education manager at the Swedish American Museum. She has published on the Romance of the Rose and Augustinian temporality, and her current research focuses on female-centered adventure in medieval romance, especially the classic Knight's Tales. She would like one day to work on the relationship between wealth and literature and maintains a side interest in detective fiction. Jacqueline spent 2 years on research fellowships in Paris, has presented her work at numerous conferences and invited lectures, coordinated the Chicago Medieval Studies Workshop, and was one of the founding members of the Lexicon Project, a working group of scholars funded by the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Jacqueline also enjoys translating and has translated academic articles from French to English for the Oxford University Press. Her teaching experience includes university courses in French language, French literature, medieval literature, academic writing, and world literature through the Reading Cultures sequence of the UChicago's Humanities Core. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Jacqueline.
Hi, thank you, Kendall. All right, let me just share my screen. Actually, before I do that, I just want to say thank you to the BASIC program for inviting me to do this lecture today. This is my first time doing a First Friday lecture, so I'm very excited to share some of the research and kind of things that I work with the Graham School. And let's see. Okay, so the title of my presentation today is The Allegory of Nature in the Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature. And I'll be talking about all three of these this concept of the allegory of nature, and then I'll be thinking about the Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature a little bit separately, but then also thinking about how they relate to one another. Why these two texts? The Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature were two sort of medieval bestsellers of their time. They were written about 100 years apart. The Plaint of Nature was written first in the 12th century, and then in the 13th century, we had the Romance of the Rose. And they both employ an allegorical figure of nature. And so I want to start with thinking about what I mean by that. What do I mean by the allegory of nature? So that will be the first question we ask. Then we'll sort of look at some ancient models. How did this allegory of nature come about? Why is this a way that medieval authors are thinking about nature? Then we'll look at what the Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature are, thinking about major themes within them, and then look at those texts closely, and then have a conclusion where I'm really thinking about how we might use allegory today, or why we don't use allegory today as much in narrative, how it sort of functions to get across certain kinds of meanings. So I really want to start, though, with this image. This is a manuscript illumination from actually a manuscript that we have here at the University of Chicago. It's really one of the treasures of our special collections. It is a manuscript that is beautifully illuminated of the Romance of the Rose. And this is a depiction of the allegory of nature. And so it's kind of, seems like a strange image at first. You have on the right-hand side a woman who is raising a hammer and holding a baby. It looks like maybe she's about to strike the baby with the hammer, which she is. And then on the left-hand side, you have this kind of couple in this sort of sexual intimacy, in the bed. And so what is happening here is on the right-hand side, this is a figure called Lady Nature, sometimes called the goddess Nature or Natura. And she is in the process of forging a baby. So in the back there, you see the forge with the fire. And this is how nature is often depicted in not just these two medieval texts, but in actually multiple other medieval texts as well, when authors are thinking about how to describe nature, what nature is, how to talk about nature. This is a figure that they use to embody, to actually embody nature. And so we can see here in this image as well that nature is going to be very closely linked to an idea of reproduction, and in particular to reproductive sex. And so we will think about that in relation to our books, because that's really what what they're turning on. Okay, there's our different names for nature. So these are two other allegorical figures here, and I just want to think now a little bit about allegory and what I mean by an allegorical figure. So on the left here, we have convoitise, and on the right, we have envie. This is covetousness, and envy. These are both from another manuscript of the Romance of the Rose. The Rose does not only feature an allegorical figure of nature, but has many, many other allegorical figures in the work. And these two right here are not figures that move and talk and participate in the narrative, but they're figures that are supposed to be on the outside of a garden wall that the protagonist encounters as he's sort of walking around. And I want to think with these two images about the different kinds of things that allegory can be. So, we think sometimes of allegory as a way of reading. So if you have a story, like you can think of George Orwell's Animal Farm, where you have a story where the actual story that's being told is not what it's about, right? It's a political allegory. So you're not really reading about animals on a farm, you're actually reading about politics. And that is one mode of allegory. So allegory can be a method of interpreting a text or a method of writing a text so that what it's about is actually about something completely different. these kinds of allegories function almost in a reverse way, where they tell you precisely what they are. So they'll say, this is covetousness, this is envy. And so why these are allegories is because there still ends up being a kind of a strangeness sometimes between what it means to embody something and have that concept. So for example, here it seems fairly straightforward, right? We have covetousness is here, reaching into a chest, maybe taking something, maybe this is someone else's chest, maybe she's taking something out of it, or maybe she's just very pleased with the objects that she has. On the right, we have envy, who's pointing over potentially to the person that she's talking about, whoever she might be envious of. And because these are static images, we don't have to worry too much about the ways in which they might not fully embody the characteristics that they're meant to portray. We see this when we see allegorical figures today, we most often see them in this kind of static imagery. So in artwork or in sculpture. And these are two photos that I took actually just this past weekend at the Art Institute of Chicago. Right now, there's an exhibit on the sculptor Canova, who mostly worked in marble. And this is showing these sort of sketches, they're calling them, these sort of clay models that he made prior to making his larger works. And as I was walking around, I noticed that a lot of his works were also allegorical figures. So you have here piety on the left, or virtue with an urn on the right. And this is really the way in which we mostly encounter these figures today. But I do want to emphasize that I think this is a really different kind of experience of allegory than we would get, for example, in a narrative. We could ask ourselves, what would happen, for example, if piety and virtue began to speak to us, right? What would they say? What kinds of personalities would they have? What kind of language would they use? What would they talk about? And importantly, how could they function within a narrative that relies on the dynamism, the progression, the temporality, and movement if they are representing unchanging concepts? So each of these kinds of questions is going to represent an opportunity for the allegory to have some kind of slippage. And this is what we'll see in some of the texts that we're going to look at. So thinking a little bit further about this idea, the scholar John Whitman addressed this aspect of allegory in the first chapter of his book, appropriately titled Allegory, the Dynamics of an Ancient and Medieval Technique. The first chapter he calls the allegorical problem. And in it, he relates the problem of allegory to the very problem of language as a way of referring to something that is actually not that thing. So he writes that all fiction, the very word confesses its exile from the truth, right? If something is fiction, it's not truthful, tries to express the truth by departing from it in some way. So he notes, that these kinds of allegorical figures are going to be, as we already discussed, different from a kind of allegorical interpretation. And that in procedure, as he writes, personification, these kinds of personified allegories, is virtually the inverse of allegorical interpretation. While interpretive allegory moves, for instance, from the fiction Athena to the underlying meaning of wisdom, compositional allegory begins with wisdom itself and constructs a fiction around it. So this will pose a different but related problem to allegorical interpretation, in which there is going to be a constant divergence between the fiction and the meaning. So to continue to quote Whitman, he writes, "The pull between correspondence and divergence sets the narrative at odds with itself." Importantly, for the allegory of nature that we're looking at today, the authors of The Romance of the Rose and The Plaint of Nature are both very subtle, and they know that allegory doesn't quite work, that it is only imperfect, and that it can only imperfectly figure what it represents, and that it might, in fact, even bring further complications into the concept it is meant to translate. So why use allegory then, right? What function then does it serve? Why describe nature as hammering away at her forge? Why not simply give an account of the natural world and man's place within it without this kind of slippery and imprecise fiction? So I propose that as I continue to talk, we just hold on to those questions in our minds in thinking about the allegory of nature. They're not really questions I'll be able to answer directly, or maybe that even have direct or single answers, but I'll try to touch on them in a few different ways to think about why would we want to represent allegory or nature as an allegory. Um, so, one way to think about this is what is unique about nature as an allegory. And this is actually a question that really I wish I could ask in a discussion rather than just pose it in a lecture, because I think we could get actually, some different and interesting responses to this. And I'll just give a few that I've come up with. So one has to do with really the expansiveness of nature. Why is nature kind of particularly strange or particularly useful or interesting as an allegory? One is that really nature is covering a very vast amount of phenomena, right? So for anybody who attended Julia's presentation on Moby Dick at the last First Friday lecture, we're sort of back to this idea of vastness. As an allegory, nature must embody something that is larger than a concept, right? Something that is also a physical, material phenomenon, something that is inclusive of a whole realm of visible, in fact, a whole realm of visible creatures, as well as ways in which the physical operations of the universe might be beyond our grasp, right? So in fact, while this is not the primary focus of my talk today, we could think that the allegories of nature that are present in our texts could be read simply for the ways in which they figure this vastness. So, I won't be talking too much about that, but really, in these allegories, we'll see that they really try to encapsulate a lot of nature. So we'll see on nature's robe, we'll have, all the different species are apparently, represented there. And that, in the discourses we get about nature, we'll be talking about the cosmos and about the workings of the planets. And so nature is really trying to figure quite a large range of things. Secondarily, nature calls up questions about the relationship between humans and the natural world. So we'll see that in both the Plaint of Nature and the Romance of the Rose, nature in particular calls attention to man's place within the natural order. Interestingly, however, we will also see that the cause of nature's complaint in the Plaint of Nature and nature's confession in the Romance of the Rose is that man behaves in a manner that goes against the natural order, and that humans can even, based on their actions, be excluded or in these texts excommunicated from the natural order. Nature is thus also a figure for human nature, but only in its sort of instability. And finally, given the sort of religiosity of the Middle Ages, nature also operates in a space in between the human, the physical world, and the divine. Referring to her as the goddess nature evokes the complications of the role that nature plays in a divine rather than simply natural order. A modern reader might think, wasn't the Middle Ages a religious time period, right? How does nature, especially the goddess nature, fit into a Christian theological worldview? Isn't there something kind of pagan about Natura, the goddess nature? And yes, we'll see that one of the defining features of the allegory of nature is that it is essentially embedded in an understanding of the natural world inherited from antiquity. From both Plato and Aristotle, and then translated through sort of Neoplatonic thought. So biblical texts can be seen in this way to offer for medieval thinkers an insufficient account of the workings of nature. The Bible offers an account of creation, but not of what keeps creation running, right? To account for physical phenomena, medieval writers and philosophers instead turned to works like Plato's Timaeus or Aristotle's Physics, and tried to move these into a Christian framework. This integration was accomplished, at least in the Plaint of Nature and the Romance of the Rose, through a poetics that relied heavily on figurative speech. So how do we talk about these kinds of ancient pagan views of nature within a context in which we don't want to think of them as always being exactly true, but as holding some kind of internal truth, some kind of kernel of truth underneath their covering, right? And that, in a way, is what allegory is. It is a way of portraying truth with a covering. That allegory is a kind of a cloak for the truth. Looking at what some of these models were, I mentioned Plato's Timaeus, Aristotle's Physics, and then this sort of nebulous term Neoplatonism, which is a sort of attempt to synthesize Platonic and Aristotelian thought. And this gets really translated through a lot of early Christian writers, such as Boethius, for example, whose Consolation of Philosophy was very influential for the Romance of the Rose. We had Prudentius's Psychomachia, which is, if you've never read this before, it's a very strange kind of allegorical battle. You have all these allegorical figures representing virtues and vices, and they have a very sort of brutal fight with one another. That's meant to take place within the soul. And we have also Macrobius' commentary on the Dream of Scipio from Cicero's Republic. And so, this is just to show that, really these works are taking a lot of ideas from antiquity, but they're working them into a very new context. And, we have not only these kinds of philosophical thoughts that they're using, but also they're using a lot of references to mythology. And particularly for the Romance of the Rose, Ovid is going to be a major intertext, including the art of love and the cura, the remedy for love, which we're going to see, that this kind of the imbrication of the natural world and human sexuality and desire are going to be exactly what these texts are talking about. Okay. So to underscore the centrality of reproduction, meaning the reproduction of species, but also reproduction through sexual intercourse, to underscore the centrality of reproduction to the work of nature, both the Plaint of Nature and the Romance of the Rose introduce a second allegorical figure as an interlocutor with nature. And they named this character Genius. So despite our associations with this word today, etymologically, genius means to beget, directly referencing the reproductive act, and calling attention thereby to nature's own etymology, which is related to birth. So while nature can thus be understood in a vaster sense that includes the workings of the planets and the seasons, for example, genius figures most specifically the reproductive function. Thus, in the Romance of the Rose, when nature enters into the narrative, she does so in order to make a confession to genius, who, as in the image shown here, is described as a priest. He actually wears the clothing of a priest, and he is described as being nature's priest. So in both the Plaint of Nature and the Romance of the Rose, in fact, we see genius clothed as a priest, and he enacts an excommunication of man at the end, not of all people, but we'll see the kinds of activities that genius excommunicates. So this generative aspect of nature is at the same time already present in antiquity, in the works of, for example, Plato and Aristotle. The scholar Jonathan Morton points out that in an earlier speech, in the Romance of the Rose, which is a speech by the allegorical figure of reason, reason goes on to situate the sexual act within Aristotelian teleology, according to which the finis, or final cause of sexual desire, is the continuation of the species. So while nature had thus been understood as reproductive and generative from the time of antiquity, both the Plaint of Nature and the Romance of the Rose move this identification into a discourse specifically concerned with human sexuality. So let's take a look at our texts. The first of these texts, the Plaint of Nature, was written in Latin in the 12th century. Both of our authors are French authors, but they're writing for two different audiences. So the Latin text is going to be written for a very scholarly and educated audience, a more clerical audience. And it is also entirely about the allegory of nature. It is called the Plaint of Nature, and that is what it is. It starts and begins kind of in that realm. The Romance of the Rose, written about 100 years later in Old French, is really working with the same kinds of intellectual sources of Alain of Lille, and in fact is directly responding to the Plaint of Nature in some ways. It's also directly responding to many, many other texts. It was written in two different parts, as far as we know, by two different poets, Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Meun. The second part, Jean de Meun, is really considered the part that sort of takes off and does something what modern readers typically find very confusing and strange, actually. This is a notoriously difficult text to read. And it is something that is known for the instability of its meaning. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that later, but I think that's important to keep in mind when thinking about the difference between these two texts, is that the Plaint of Nature is going to be written in a way where we're really focusing on nature's discourse, where in the Romance of the Rose, it's going to be one of many, many allegorical figures and episodes. And the way in which these episodes and figures relate to one another is very unstable and very complicated. So some major themes in the embodiment of nature. So now we're just going to be looking only at the nature's discourse in Romance of the Rose, and then at the Plaint of Nature. So one is the embodied figure of nature. So when nature enters the story, we get a description of her. We see appearance and clothing. We also hear the poet, talk about the difficulty of describing nature. Nature is very clearly gendered as a woman, which is an interesting aspect of allegory as well. Nature's activities are the reproduction of species, primarily. That's why we get nature at her forge. We get these large descriptions of the natural world and the cosmos. So we'll think about the diversity of plant and animal life. There will be discourses about alchemy. Alchemy in the sense that an individual version of a species can actually be changed into another individual, though the form of the species never changes. We'll talk about different natural phenomena on planets. So you really get this this broad overview of nature in these texts. And then we'll also talk about, these texts will also talk about the relationship between art and nature. This will especially be the case in the Rose, but you also see it in the Plaint of Nature, that these two authors are really thinking about the difficulty of even imagining or trying to portray nature or trying to think about what nature is, and how art, enables us to do that, but also always fails at it. And then finally, the main thrust of these texts, the place that they end up really has to do with the corrupted relationship between humans and nature. Okay. So let's start with the Plaint of Nature. So just to give a kind of overview of the work, it begins with a poet narrator who is lamenting about human sexuality. And he laments that the active sex is horrified that it thus falls disgracefully into the passive role. So right from the very beginning of the text, it's telling you what the problem is going to be for nature. And in the Plaint of Nature, this problem is really going to be homosexuality. And the idea that men are acting like women. And even though this is mostly translated through kind of the sex act and the different kind of metaphors for thinking about sex. At the same time, it also has to do with gender presentation. So nature will complain about the way that men are grooming themselves, that they're grooming themselves in too feminine of a way. They're combing their hair too carefully, and kind of, these kinds of concerns that really place sexuality within a very gendered context. So nature will then arrive from this unchanging realm, and there will be this description of nature that's given. Nature will talk about how she has to translate pure intellect into speech and what that means, right? So it will say she painted the workings of intellect with the shapes of material language and in effect translated archetypal words preconceived in the realm of ideas into actual speech. So already here we're getting this sense that what we're reading is somehow representing something broader that it can't actually represent. But then we get this descriptions of the universe and the natural order. We get nature talking about how she is subordinate to God. Okay, which is a way of trying to, for these authors, of trying to situate this within a Christian context that, okay, we have the goddess nature, but the nature is somehow being commanded by God. And then the poet notices that nature is very tearful, right? He says, "Why does a rain of tears water your face?" And then he notices also that her garment, which shows all the different species, is torn, right? And that this there's a tear in it. And he asks, why is your garment torn? To which she's like, "You don't understand why it's torn?" She can't understand why he wouldn't already know this. And so nature begins her complaint. And her complaint really has to do, again, with man not obeying her natural order, not obeying nature's way of working. So she says, "But from the rule of this universal order, man alone has been drawn away, an unaccountable exception. But man, who has nearly emptied my entire treasury of its riches, seeks to put the natural gifts of nature to an unnatural use, and wounds me with the weapons of a solipsistic Venus. She says, for the human race, fallen away from its noble origin, is barbarous in its construction of gender and practices a most irregular metaplasm that inverts the rules of genius. So in thinking about these two quotations here, I've highlighted a couple of words here, and these words have to do with grammar. And so this is a very important sort of aspect of this, is that what nature starts to talk about is she starts to think about sexuality in relationship to improper grammar. And in particular, when we think about metaplasm, she's thinking about it in relationship to the improper transfer in this context of the genders of Latin nouns into Romance languages where they have been regendered and given different genders. So she said, of those men who practice the grammar of Venus, some are inclined to embrace only those of masculine gender, others those who are feminine, others whose gender is common. Certain ones indeed, as of Heteroclete, are inclined or declined irregularly, during winter in the feminine, during summer in the masculine gender. So I think we can, already see and kind of understand what nature is talking about here, right? She's talking about the ways in which men are acting like women. In particular, it doesn't really have a lot to do with how women are acting, I will say. This really has to do with men as being seen as the gender that provides form to matter. If there's a problem with sexuality, it's going to be located in men rather than in women. And this grammatical metaphor is, I think, something that we can think of as fairly strange. So that it's really calling attention to the relationship between language and a kind of alienation of man from what nature would think of as the natural order. Nature goes on. For since, as grammar bears witness, natural reason has recognized two genders, namely masculine and feminine, though certain men, deprived of the marks of their sex, might, in my opinion, be assigned to a neuter category, I nevertheless charge the Cyprian with friendly advice and with mighty thunderous threats that in consideration of necessity, she should sanction in her conjoinings only the natural relationship of the masculine and feminine genders. Okay. So this is the plaint of nature, and this is really the thrust of what nature's complaint is going to be in this text. And it's going to involve, when we think about nature as being about reproduction and about the reproduction of the species, it's going to be a way of thinking about homosexuality as somehow out of that natural order because nature herself is about reproductive sex. And we're going to see that the Romance of the Rose is going to take this idea and really do something a little bit different with it. Okay. So in the conclusion of the Plaint of Nature, nature then describes many other vices that are apparently also out of the order of nature. So there are gluttony, overdrinking, envy, flattery, lechery, avarice. There's a long discourse about money, about how people who keep their money and keep too much money are also going against the natural order. There's this really, the language in this work is very strange and very interesting. So for example, when describing gluttony, the writer Alain de Lille writes, this pestilence, not content with the humble crowd, is more widespread among prelates, who, defiling the rite of baptism, baptize at the font of holy pepper, salmon, pike, and other fish distinguished by an equally imposing nobility, which are tortured with various forms of martyrdom as they are cooked, so that from this baptism, the newly baptized may attain a manifold grace of flavor. This is a very unusual use of the metaphor of baptism to describe basically cooking fish with pepper to make them more flavorful. And you get this throughout. There's a lot of references to pepper as a sort of vice, really, in this work. So even though the primary thrust of the work is really about this kind of sexual deviance, nature is using this to also talk about all these other kinds of vices. And they're all getting sort of twisted through this very poetic, very metaphorical, very strange language. So at the very end, Hymen, the husband of Venus, arrives. He looks appropriately very manly. And the other allegorical figures representing other virtues arrive, starting with chastity. Nature then asks Hymen to deliver a message to Genius, who arrives dressed as a priest. And Genius excommunicates from nature all men who partake in the vices enumerated in the narrative. So not only the sexual vices, but also all of these other vices. He says, let them be declared unworthy of the grace of nature, banished from the united community of the natural order. So there's a couple of questions that I think come out of this. Well, there's many, many questions that come out of this. One has to do with the virtue of chastity. And we will see that in the Romance of the Rose, chastity is in fact not a virtue. Because I think John de Meun is going to look at this and say, well, if really what this is about is reproductive sex, if being within the natural order has to do with reproduction, then chastity is also outside of the natural order. Chastity is also working against nature. So there's going to be a kind of a very complex relationship to virtue and morality within the Romance of the Rose. And then I think in addition, we can ask ourselves, what does it mean to banish someone from nature, right? How can man be excommunicated from nature? What can possibly exist outside of the natural order? So these are just a couple of questions that I think this work raises for us. So now to move on to the Romance of the Rose. The Plaint of Nature was a direct model for the Romance of the Rose, which follows a similar structure and resembles it very closely in parts. However, the Romance of the Rose is also doing something very different from the Plaint of Nature. One of the first and major differences between the two, as already mentioned, is that the Plaint of Nature is an entire text unto itself, while Nature's discourse in the Romance of the Rose is only one episode in a longer allegorical dream poem that features numerous other allegorical and mythological speech characters such as Reason, Fair Welcome, an old woman, and Venus. It is a notoriously difficult text, and this is partially because its different parts contradict one another by design. The dominant structuring and interpretive device of the Rose is the idea of contraire choses, or opposites, in which meaning arises from the interaction of diverse and competing discourses. This approach to understanding was an important feature of medieval scholasticism, particularly the disputatio, in which opposing sides were put together in order to get at a truth between them. So notably, the author of the Plaint of Nature, Alain of Lille, was not enamored of scholasticism. And so this can be read as one of the sources of difference between the two works. Alain of Lille is trying to give you one very easy kind of way of interpreting nature. He's saying there's a sexual deviation, there are these different vices, they're going to be excommunicated from nature. We're going to see that the Rose makes that a little bit more complicated. So because of this, nature's discourse in the Romance of the Rose should be read in conjunction with other discourses, most notably that of Reason. We won't have time for that kind of comparative reading today, but it's something to keep in mind when considering how to interpret the allegory of nature in the Rose. The meaning of the Rose, if we want to assume that any such meaning could ever be definitively located in the text, which I don't think it can thus not be found in any single allegorical figure or any single episode, but rather through their interaction, which requires the reader to produce the meaning of the text. This orients us in a very different way towards nature's speech. So the other major and possibly related difference is that nature and genius in the Romance of the Rose, in lamenting human sexual deviance, are not only concerned with non-reproductive sex, but are straightforward in exhorting men to have sex, seemingly as much reproductive sex as possible. In this sense, chastity cannot be seen as a virtue in nature's confession in the Rose. Here in this manuscript illumination, we find, similar to the image that started this presentation, a straightforward depiction of what nature and genius mean when they use metaphors to discuss reproductive sex. The centrality of this meaning was clearly understood by readers and illuminators of the text. It's made very literal here. At its halfway point, the Romance of the Rose even renames itself the Mirror for Lovers. At the same time, despite this encouragement towards reproductive sex, genius introduces very misogynistic descriptions of women, even telling them to flee women, men to flee women, which partially undermine his own message about heterosexual intercourse, which itself becomes unstable. When we think about the kinds of grammar employed in the Plaint of Nature, it doesn't quite work. In general, the Romance of the Rose can be seen to portray a more actively sexual but less stable allegory of nature. The Romance of the Rose is in fact structured around a long quest to pluck or to have sex with a rose that stands in for a female object of desire. Although the fact that this object of desire is always a rose and never a woman is notable. The basic plot follows a dreamer, narrator, poet character who wakes up one day within a dream, he's still dreaming, and walks until he comes to a walled garden peopled with allegorical figures. We've already seen the allegorical images on the outside of the garden, but inside the garden are walking and talking allegories that represent the finer aspects of courtly life. Within this garden, he comes across the fountain of Narcissus, and in this fountain, he glimpses a rose, which he then falls in love with, literally struck by the god of love's arrows. In fact, it's quite gruesome the way that they strike him. He tries to seduce the rose to no avail and laments in despair before engaging with a number of allegorical figures who represent wholly different ways of thinking about love and desire. Along the way, there are multiple digressions into discourses on philosophy, theology, current events, mythology, the Golden Age, and a host of other subjects, with the story ultimately culminating in taking the rose by force, typically understood as a kind of sexual assault, after the dreamer narrator storms her castle along with the god of love's army. So we can see then that the allegory of nature is going to function very differently in the rose than in the Plaint of Nature. And I'll now take a look at the text more closely so we can see some of its points of intersection and deviation. So one is it's going to really begin with this idea that nature is in a race with death. Okay, so not only is nature reproductive, but this reproduction is urgent, right? So in the foreground here, we have nature like urgently making a lot of humans. And then in the background, we have death killing those same humans later. And so we're going to get this sense that, that reproduction is something that we need to really speed up. In terms of other major topics, it will talk again about the influence of the planets in the heavens, gets into a long discourse about castration, which it's very opposed to. It talks about predestination and free will. It gives a really interesting thought experiment about animals that we'll take a look at. Talks about optics and mirrors and art as an imitator of nature, about what it means to have visions and dreams, and then also about nobility, which it argues should be based on virtue and not, in fact, on lineage. So we can see that it's really using this, this figure of nature to talk about a lot of things that are sort of tangentially related to the idea of nature and the natural order. So to look at the animal thought experiment, this will just give an idea of the different ways in which humans are seen in this text as sort of alienated from nature or as occupying a very strange place in the world of nature. So at some moment, nature says that without a doubt, all dumb animals, empty and bare of understanding, are by nature incapable of knowing themselves. For if they had speech and reason with which to understand one another so that they could instruct each other, it would be an evil occurrence for men. And she explains why. The beautiful chargers with their manes would never let themselves be subdued, nor allow knights to mount them. The ox would never put his horned head beneath the yoke of the cart. No donkey, mule, or camel would ever carry a load for man or consider him worth a cake. No dog or cat would serve him, for they could very well get along without him. Bears, wolves, lions, leopards, and wild boars would all want to strangle man. Even the rat would that's supposed to be strangle. Even the rat would strangle him when he was little in his cradle. For no call would any bird ever put its skin in danger. Instead, it could harm man very much by putting out his eyes while he was sleeping. And this goes on, and if you're curious to see the many more damages that animals can inflict on humans, I can show other slides after this presentation. Goes on to talk about all the damage gruesomely that kind of insects could do to man as well. So within this, we see that the rose is kind of a little bit more playful, right? When it's thinking about man's relationship to nature. So humans are seen to distinguish themselves not only on the basis of their virtues and vices, but on the basis of their reasoning and their language, right? These animals do not have the ability to reason and have language. But we assume that if they did, right, that there's something about man that already marks him out as distinct from nature. And that if animals had the ability to, they would in fact destroy humans. So this is an unsettling thought experiment that calls into question humans' relationship to nature in a greater sense. The very idea that humans dominate over other animals is shown to be that something that animals would resent, and that might itself not be natural. Okay. So another sort of unique aspect of this text is, as sort of mentioned earlier, the way in which it introduces these really misogynistic discourses about women. So it says, for example, that women will anger easily, that the faults of women are so many and so grave that they can't even be told par rime ne par vers, like by rhyme or verse. Like this poet can't even tell us about them. Women are indiscreet. They try to weasel secrets out of men who are foolish to trust them. Women are like serpents in the grass. And there's a direct address to men where they say, like, lords, watch out for women. They say, flee, 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 like this really many times repeated, that just telling men to actually just flee women. I'm not saying that you shouldn't cherish women or sleep with them, because after all, you need to continue the species. But he says, just don't be sure that you don't give them any power when you're in bed with them, right? So taisier means like, be quiet, keep silent, keep quiet. Don't give them power over you by revealing any of your secrets to women, because women can't stop talking and won't keep your secrets. So this at the beginning, comes early on in nature's discourse here. And this is actually genius who's talking right now. And this is a kind of strange thing to come early in an allegory that's really going to be telling people to have as much kind of sexual intercourse as possible, even though it's careful to say, I'm not saying don't sleep with women, I'm just saying flee women. These are kind of really at odds with one another. And as part of the oddness of what the rose is always doing and giving you two really different ideas and just making you figure out what's going on. So nature, again, has a complaint. And we'll see that this is, similar to the complaint in the Plaint of Nature. So she says, I don't need to complain about the sky. I do not complain about the 7 planets, nor do I complain of the elements or the plants or the other animals, right? I only complain about man. And then nature, who has really been identified very clearly as a woman, says women are incapable of concealing anything, and so I shall relate all his vices and give a true account of everything, right? Nature is going to speak because she's a woman and she can't stop speaking. So we get the same complaint as we got in the Plaint of Nature, which is really about, and nature, interestingly enough, doesn't really tell it to us extremely explicitly. Nature mentions that there's this problem with men. She alludes to what it is. I think it's clear, especially if you're reading the Plaint of Nature as an intertext, what she's talking about. But it's really genius later who starts to talk about the fact that that people just aren't having sex enough. They're not having the right kinds of sex, that people are banging on the wrong kinds of anvils. They're using their hammers incorrectly, and starts using all of this language about anvils and hammers that really gets like kind of exaggerated and out of control to think about sexuality. So then he begins to do something really different from what the Plaint of Nature is doing, right? Instead of sort of just saying, well, you should be having these very particular kinds of heterosexual relationships, he starts really encouraging sexual activity, right? So it says, it was an evil hour when nature, in accordance with her laws and customs, gave to those false ones of whom I have been speaking their styluses and tablets. So styluses and tablets being another metaphor for intimacy. Hammers and anvils, the plowshares with very good sharp points for the use of their plows, and the fallow fields, not stony, but rich and verdurous, that need to be plowed and dug deep if one wants to enjoy them. It is an evil hour when they do not want to labor at serving and honoring nature, but wish rather to destroy her, by preferring to flee from her anvils, her tablets and fallow fields, which she made so precious and so dear in order to continue things so that death might not kill them. And then Genius goes on. He says, plow for God's sake, my barons, plow and restore your lineages. Unless you think on plowing vigorously, there is nothing that can restore them. Tuck up your clothes in front as though to take the air. Or if you please, be quite bare, but don't get too cold or too hot. With your two hands quite bare, raise the guide boards of your plows, support them stoutly with your arms, and exert yourself to push in stiffly with the plowshare in the straight path, the better to sink into the furrow. And when you have plowed so much that you are tired out and it comes to the point where you have to rest, for nothing can last long without rest, you will not be able to begin again immediately to advance the job farther, but do not let your desire flag. So this is extremely explicit. Even though Genius here is using a metaphor of plowing, it's very clear what he's talking about. It's obvious why medieval readers immediately understood this as a sexual metaphor. It is almost, barely a metaphor, right? The sort of language in it as, being bare, the stiffness, it's all extremely explicit, and so explicit, in fact, that it almost works against the kind of virtue, right, that we see in a work like The Plaint of Nature, especially when we think that chastity is a virtuous character who is valued at the end of The Plaint of Nature. And so, how are we supposed to read this? How are we supposed to understand this really explicit call to sex? I think we can think of it there's many ways we could think of it. One way we could think of it has to do with the idea actually of clerical abstinence at this time. So only in the century prior was clerical abstinence enforced within the Christian world, following the First and Second Lateran Councils of the 12th century. And this was met with huge resistance. There were many, many people who really did not think that either priests or clerics, in fact, should have to be celibate. And so, we know that Jean de Meun was clerical, but both he and Alain of Lille were clerical figures. And so they're working in that realm. And I think the idea of who should and shouldn't be having sex was something that people were extremely within that realm concerned about at this time. And Jean de Meun seems to be saying here, at least giving in this speech, that kind of viewpoint, right? That not participating in this kind of reproductive act is somehow against nature, even though it's at odds then with the kind of Christian virtue of chastity, and that those two concepts are going to be put into conversation with one another. Another part of this conversation is Reason, who comes in earlier in the text and who basically says that, you shouldn't be worrying so much about sexual desire, that this is a kind of, this is not really a virtue. And what you should be doing is putting your desire into a love for all mankind, right? Into a love of humanity, into a love of society. And so there's another discourse that comes earlier than this in the work that is really arguing for something entirely different than this. So when we read this, it's hard to know exactly what Jean de Meun would be trying to say. If he would really be saying you should actually be doing this kind of activity, or if he's it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek and we're supposed to really be thinking more about reason, and her exhortation to this other kind of love for man in a more general sense. The Romance of the Rose will never tell us, right? It will never tell us which side it comes down on, and it will just kind of put these two ideas next to each other and will force us to think through them together. So Genius does, in the end, show a kind of a right path. So he says, think how to do honor to nature. Serve her by working well. If you get anything from someone else, give it back. If you know how, give it back if you know how. And if you cannot give back the good things that are spent or played away, have the goodwill to do so when you have the benefits in plenty. Avoid killing, keep both hands and mouth clean, be loyal and compassionate, and then you will go by the delectable fields, following the path of the Lamb, living eternally to drink from the beautiful fountain. I think it's notable that in this ending passage, when he's saying, the actions that we have to take to essentially have salvation, none of them have anything to do with sexuality. So even though we've just listened to this entire, discourse about sexuality and about how, people aren't doing the right things and aren't participating in the right kinds of sexual acts, and we should be having as much sex as possible, in the end, it moves into this really elaborate description of the park of the Lamb, the park of the good Lamb, this place that we all want to end up, that takes the place of the initial garden that the lover had found, the kind of courtly garden. Instead, we want to go back to this kind of a golden age. In order to get there, really, it has to do with generosity, with this very odd pairing of avoiding killing and keeping both your hands and mouth clean, which we could read potentially as not just being physically clean. And so, it's again doing something where it's just presented us with a narrative that seems to be telling us one thing. And then at the end, what it tells us we need to do is actually something completely different. So that is an overview of the Allegory of Nature in the Romance of the Rose and the Plaint of Nature. They're obviously much longer than that. They go into all kinds of, kind of long descriptions and different kinds of discourses. But I just wanted to give a sense of how this allegory is being used overall, and especially to focus on the idea of man as being somehow out of order with nature, and what it would mean to bring man back into that kind of order or not. And so, to end, I wanted to think about whether or not this kind of allegory, would function today, right? So we saw that in order to talk about these kinds of concepts, we had a lot of metaphorical language we had metaphorical language about grammar, we had all this metaphorical language about plowing, and it's all being pushed through this allegory of nature that all of a sudden seems maybe kind of strange. Do we agree that that's what nature would say? Do we agree that this is part of the order of nature? What does it mean to present that as embodied literally within nature? So the image that I have here is part of the discourse of nature's speech in the rose that concerns the relationship between nature and art. And in it, nature says that art can only imitate nature, that it can never produce anything productive or, or fecund, really, that it's just an imitation. But on the other hand, it's the way that we have of interpreting and understanding nature. So I'll just kind of end, in a rose-like fashion with, some questions. So one question could be, could we imagine allegory as a way of representing nature today? And if not, what does that tell us about the medieval models or how we see nature differently today? And what would that look like in a modern context? So though our representations of nature and nature's limit might not be the same today, and although certainly questions of sexuality are still being litigated and are issues in many religious traditions, we can see that beyond this focus on sexuality, the allegory of nature brings up larger points about the relationship between humans and nature, and also our ability to comprehend or even talk about that relationship. We might think of reproduction today in terms of issues of overpopulation and extinction. We could think about nature in terms of women's rights and gender relations, all of which are at issues in these medieval works as well, although they see them from a different angle. So though the allegory of nature is distinctly medieval, and many of its forms and concerns may seem distant and strange to us, it can be seen as a very knowing very poetic and sort of artificial way of exploring concepts that continue to be relevant. Most importantly, perhaps, is whether human nature acts in accordance with the natural order, and if not, then what is human nature? Or is there a natural order? Can we too be excommunicated from the natural order? Or are we somehow bound up in it? So I'd just like to end with those questions rather than a declaration, which seems, sort of appropriate to the kinds of texts we've looked at today, which attempt to resist any easy interpretation and instead posit in each way their own questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline.
Yeah.
And we have a number of questions here. In fact, 8 total questions. So bear that in mind when framing your answers. So the first question and the last question actually come from Ray Lucchese. And Ray asks, this will be question number 1 from Ray, don't you think that the Middle Ages demanded some form of allegorical treatment of reproduction, sort of like how critics of tyranny today have to cloud or obscure their criticisms.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we do have some medieval texts, right, where sexuality will be treated in a much more explicit way. These are usually these kind of very popular kind of body, like we call them fabliaux in the French context, these kinds of tales. But in this kind of context that these two authors are writing in, which is in a more learned context, and for people who were learned at this time, they came through a clerical and a sort of clerical education, of which the sort of highest endpoint would have been theology. And so any education was sort of filtered through that. And so I think within that context, that's a great point. Yeah, that allegory in some way, that in order to cover, you talk about sexuality, that you need to give it this kind of cover. Yeah, I think nature, though, asks even a bigger question about that, right? Which is like, how do we know nature, right? How can we talk about it? And if we're using fiction to talk about it, then maybe we just need to make that, as fictional as possible, and sort of, get to this idea of nature as what they called an integumentum, which was something that was, integumentum was a covering for the truth. But it is a good point that in this kind of domain, you might not have had very explicit descriptions of sexuality. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Jacqueline. Next question comes from Robert Riva, who asks, you mentioned the personification of the virtues, for example, in the Psychomachia. At the risk of going too far afield, would you comment on the Decameron as possibly fertile ground for allegorical analysis? I have in mind Joan Ferrante's work on the Decameron, in which the undisclosed, quote, true, close quote, names of the fictional 7 women of the frame story are actually the 4 cardinal and 3 theological virtues.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that is a big question. It's been I haven't really worked ever closely on the Decameron, I'll admit. So I don't know if I'll have like a great answer within that specific context. But what I can say is that this text, The Romance of the Rose, was extraordinarily influential. It might seem very strange to us now, and we don't really read it very much now, but it was very influential on, for example, Chaucer, who wrote a translation of it. It was very influential on Dante. And we could also imagine that it was influential for something like the Decameron. I think that this is also, these kind of allegorical techniques are very common in the Middle Ages. And that the Middle Ages was a time period in which people were always looking for meanings, behind, we're always looking for meanings behind something. And part of this, so for example, there was a text in the Middle Ages called the Moralized Ovid. And this was a way of, the Moralized Ovid would give you the mythology of Ovid from the Metamorphoses. And then under that, it would explain these myths in the context of a Christian framework as sort of anticipating the revelation or the, and anticipating the birth of Christ. And so it was a way of reading each myth and then making another meaning from it, right? So the sort of allegorical style of reading was, I think, a way that medieval people were trained to read, and that you would see it in a lot of different works. And I wish I could say more about the Decameron in particular, but I would think that all of these kinds of questions would be relevant there as well.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Robert, for your question. The next question comes from Paul Drexler, who asks, if I wanted to read these texts, is there a book with Old French on one page and modern French or English on the facing page?
So yeah, so for the Plaint of Nature, which that's a Latin one, and there's a really good modern edition. That's the one I was citing, and it's translated by Winthrop Weatherby. And it's I should have it over here somewhere. And that would be the one that I would recommend, would be the thank you, Kendall, Winthrop Weatherby translation. It might even be at the end of his name 2 E's instead of a Y. I can't quite remember. And then for the Romance of the Rose, I'm not aware of a facing page Old French English translation. The English translation that I think is the best is Charles Dahlberg, which is Princeton University Press. But it doesn't have the Old French in it. but you could do a little, you could make your own little system. You could buy an Old French, modern French version, which there are facing page Old French, modern French, and then get the Dahlberg, and then, try to work it out from there. But the Dahlberg is a very good translation that I would recommend. And he gives verse numbers throughout so that you can refer to the Old French text.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Paul, for your question. The next one comes from Jerry Ree, who says, wow, I see what you're doing. Wonderful. My question is about power in nature and allegory. Quote, this is insurrection. Quote, this is genocide. Who decides, man or woman?
Can you repeat that? I want to think about that for a second.
All righty. Wow, I see what you're doing. Wonderful. That's the part you wanted to hear again.
Yeah.
My question is about power in nature and allegory. This is insurrection, quote unquote. This is genocide, quote unquote. Who decides, man or woman?
Good question. I would say that if we wanted to, I might not be understanding the question correctly. That's possible. If I want to think about this question of who decides, man or woman, in these texts, it is man, I would say, fairly clearly. I would say that, the fact that genius is nature's priest, the fact that nature is always subordinate to God, the fact that nature is somehow, the idea that man can be excommunicated from nature makes nature something a little bit unstable, I think, in terms of how we think about man's place in the universe. And all the discourses in these works are really about men. I mean, I don't see very much concern, and we don't see very much concern in the Middle Ages with female homosexuality, for example. Whereas we do see concern with male homosexuality, and this probably has something to do with the idea of choosing, right? That somehow men are choosing to, to be fertile or not, whereas women are just like going to be fertile and going to be, available, I think is the mindset. And so I would say that, and also I would say that the intellectual context in which both Jean de Meun and Alain of Lille are working are extremely masculine intellectual contexts. They're working in this kind of Parisian milieu of the 12th and 13th centuries, which is going to be a clerical milieu. And they'll have, been part of the University of Paris, especially Jean de Meun. And you get this sense that they're working in an environment where their interlocutors are men, for the most part. And there is a much more concern with masculinity than with women. And the rose, I will say, is a very, even though it's hard to locate a kind of meaning in it, it feels very misogynistic as a work. I mean, it has a lot of really misogynistic kind of discourses in it about 100 years later, a female writer, Christine de Pizan, will begin something called the Quarrel of the Rose, which was the first ever recorded literary quarrel that we know of, where she took offense, to the rose. And she said, this is an extraordinarily offensive text. The way that it talks about women is not right. And other people will defend it, and they'll say, well, okay, maybe, but it's doing all of these other really interesting and great things. And then she gets some allies, very powerful allies at the time, like Jean Gerson in Paris, who are going to be on her side actually and say like, yeah, this work is actually morally problematic. And so people won't always be agreeing with her in terms of its presentation of gender, but people will agree with her in terms of its really dubious morality. So things like nature's speech or the way that Genius is talking about sexuality here did bother some people, and did seem kind of immoral or amoral. And so you do have later a kind of a woman responding to it and creating a kind of discourse around this work within the time that it was written and that the Plaint of Nature was written. It feels like such a masculine kind of intellectual community that they're working within. And you get the sense that really the question is about men and not about women. Yeah.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks,
Yeah.
Jerry, for your question. The next question, which seems to flow really from what you were just saying, comes from Lou Schorsch, who asks, do you view the rose as subversive of Catholic orthodoxy of the time, or ultimately supportive, or somewhere in between?
It's a really great question. This is like nobody knows how to interpret the rose. So this is like if you want to join the fray and put your ideas out there. This is like scholars are constantly debating what this work means and what it's doing. In some ways, yeah, it feels very subversive. In other ways, it doesn't at all. And I think this comes down to the kind of intellectual framework that it's working in, which is a framework of oppositions, right? A framework in which different ideas are put into conversation with one another, and you have to work them out. They're in dispute. They're literally in dispute with one another. And so what does it, there's a kind of slipperiness to that though, at the same time, right? People have written about the rose that in a way it allows Jean de Meun to say things that he otherwise wouldn't get away with saying by sort of, washing his hands of it, right? By saying, oh, but that's not really what I also said this other thing. So for example, he addresses women at some point in the work and he says like, ladies, don't be offended, by everything I've just said. I'm not talking about you, specifically. I'm just talking about, these other women who are probably worse than you. And so he gives this kind of apology that's not really an apology. So the work is always kind of undermining itself, but in a way that's a protective stance, right? And so, where you can always disavow what you've said. And so, do I see it as subversive? I think in nature's discourse feels very subversive of orthodoxy at that time. Yes, it does.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And to follow on Jacqueline's observation that the rose is great to debate the meaning about, I put the link. It's the most recent contribution to the chat for Jacqueline's spring quarter course on the romance of the rose.
Yes, yeah, we can read. If you would like to read through the rose with me, we can do that in the spring. It's a very, very interesting text that gives you a lot on each page.
And now the next question comes from Michelle Cooper, who asks, is there a correlation between plagues or other mass death, like war and famine, with the publication of works that emphasize controlling reproduction?
Oh, that's a great question. This is a question I kind of have as well, actually, when I'm thinking about what is the rose doing when it's like promoting sexuality so exuberantly, why? And the time period in which it's written is a fairly, I would say, optimistic time period. So really when we get to the plague and to like the 100 Years' War, those are going to start in the next century. And so at this time period in the 12th century, there's not really this, people are dealing with death all the time in a way that we don't necessarily with our modern kind of medicine. But the sense that, things were really falling apart that you get during the plague and during the 100 Years' War, that hasn't quite happened yet. And so I don't think at this moment that's a very huge concern for people. On the other hand, the prevalence of just the sort of difficulty of life and the amount of people who died in different kinds of wars, and you had also the Crusades and all sorts of things happening, may have made that more present in people's minds. That's possible. But it's strange because I don't get the feeling that people were worried about population at this time. I don't get the feeling that people were thinking, oh, there just aren't enough of this in the world, or that we need to, make so many more humans. That's partly why it feels strange. It's hard to know why you would encourage this. Nature, it seems like humans are winning the race against death, in this time period. So.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Michelle, for your question. The next question comes from Trish Gerber, who asks, it's obvious, well, actually, she may think that you've already answered this a bit. It's obvious that the author and nature is speaking to men only. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think, what I said earlier would be pretty similar to what I would say now. I agree. I think the author is speaking, well, in the Plaint of Nature, the author is speaking only to men. In the Romance of the Rose, I think the author is speaking to both men and women. And part of the reason for that is because it's written in Old French, and that the decision to write it in the vernacular means a wider, more gender diverse audience. And I think that's something important to think about. It's also very strange within that context. Most works written in the vernacular are like romances or knight's tales or epics, to get this kind of really strange, like philosophical kind of text written in the vernacular is part of what's unique about it. And it also implies a wider audience. So I think it's written in a from a very masculine context. The audience would have been a little bit more diverse for the Rose.
That's interesting. Thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks, Trish, for your question. The next question comes from, actually, we have two more, from Ray Lucchese. And Ray asks, don't you think the backlash against LGBTQ today is an echo of the Plaint of Nature?
Yeah, I think so. Almost when I'm, thinking of a conclusion to this topic, I almost want to say sometimes, well, our discourse about nature is so different today, but that's partly because I'm thinking of a discourse about nature that's about global warming or about, environmental degradation. But you're right, there is another discourse that is still happening that is very similar to this, right? That somehow, different diverse sexualities are out of the order of nature, right? And that this is, I think increasingly something that we're sort of litigating in maybe a disturbing way. And it is it's uncomfortable, I think, right? To read the Plaint of Nature in light of a lot of things that are going on today and to see how we're still kind of having some of these same conversations. Yeah, I think that's very true.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Ray, for your question. Now, here's a question from Paul Drexler again, and I think that it kind of follows up in an interesting way on the gender questions and your answers to them, which is, how did women readers at the time react to the texts?
Yeah, we other than Christine de Pizan, we don't entirely know, so Christine de Pizan's writing later about it and in responding to it very negatively, I would say. And then at the time, we don't entirely know. What we do know is a very popular. So we have over 200 manuscripts of the Rose, which is a huge number for any text in this time period. Those are surviving ones. We have one here at University of Chicago. A lot of them are beautiful manuscripts, just beautifully illuminated. They were luxury objects. People talked about this work all the time. Like I said, it was hugely, like Chaucer wrote a translation of it. I mean, it was, we know that women must have read it. We can assume by the way that Jean de Meun sort of speaks to women that he's also assuming that maybe women are going to not like certain aspects of this text. He's preempting that. So I would imagine that there were other women besides Christine de Pizan who felt uncomfortable with the work's way of speaking about women. That said, it was so popular that, maybe people were also willing to, I enjoy this text in a way, right? Even though it's very misogynistic, because it's also so interesting. So, I think people could have had a kind of mixed response as well.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Paul, for your question. There are a few comments that are not questions, and I'll send them on to you because they're very complimentary. And now is the time. Before we let everybody go, I'm going to allow everyone to unmute themselves so that you can enjoy applause. So thank you very much, Jacqueline.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a great talk and
superb.
Great questions. Oh yes, I'll be quiet. You guys can yell complimentary things.
And if anybody ever wants to talk more about the Rose, just let me know.
Thank you. Fabulous.
Yeah.